pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today. Ron and I are former colleagues at the Pennsylvania Conference office, and it occurred to me while I was sitting there, some people might not know what a conference is. But, basically the church is organized. This is the local church, and within the Pennsylvania Conference, there's about 130 churches, and we're all organized together. Then within the Pennsylvania Conference, it's part of the Columbia Union, which takes up several states and all the churches. And then the Union is part of the North American Division, which comprises the United States, Canada, and a few attached fields such as Guam. And then our North American Division is part of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, which is the worldwide organization, because there's divisions all over the world. There's unions, there's conferences. So what you see here, if this is the first time here or you never understood that organization, is that this is a worldwide field. And in fact, remember the film you saw during the offering, as the offering was being taken up, Ron is trilingual. He can speak Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And the reason why he can speak Portuguese is because he was a missionary in Brazil. So, as I said, Ron and I have had a lot of experiences together. One of Ron's favorite saying is, "Will, we've got miles to go." And we do have miles to go, don't we? Not only as a church, but individually. And as we come together to worship, I'm sure that the message that Elder Christman will be presenting to us will continue us on that straight and narrow way. And also the seminar that he'll be presenting afterwards. You know, some of you are familiar with those gray buckets I bring out every once in a long while. And some of you can probably, it's about tithing and offerings and special projects. Well, one time in a church, I brought those out, and there was a person in a pew, they told me this, they said, "Oh no, here he comes again." You know why? Because the Holy Spirit was convicting that person. And that person, after about the third time, said, "Well, I've got to change my giving pattern." And they did. And so the seminar that Elder Christman will be presenting will be about church finances, but it'll be from a spiritual perspective. And so if you're feeling, "Oh no, here it comes again," or "Boy, I got to get home, lunch, et cetera," that may be the same way that the other person was feeling as the Holy Spirit was convicting them. So, Ron, we're thankful that you're with us, and we appreciate you being here and be willing to leave your Pottsville church for a Sabbath. I know I don't like to leave our church for a Sabbath. And of course we're live streaming, so you'll also be speaking to what we like to call Kenhorst Nation, because there's all kinds of people that love the Kenhorst Church that are spread out all over the country, and they're viewing us live stream. So thank you, Kenhorst Nation, and God bless as you present.
Thank you so much.
It's really good to be, It's really good to be here. And some of you may not be aware, because I've not been here as often as other places, but I'm an admirer of the Kenhorst Church. You are close to my heart. As the treasurer of the conference, I was always concerned about the Kenhorst Church. And the reason I'm concerned about the Kenhorst Church is because you have a real mission field. It's a real mission field, and you could see it this morning with the young people up here. Every day during the school year, there is a mission field happening just next door. And it's really, really important. You're doing a work that is exceptional. And so I've been concerned. I've been anxious about the Kenhorst Church. Can they keep it up? Can they keep it up? And I've been promoting the Kenhorst Church from every perspective back, especially in the days of Treasury. I was concerned that we keep this mission field alive. And so I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the decades of work that you're doing here in the Kinhorst Church. And your greatest mission field is really next door. But you have a mission field everywhere. I recognize that. We all have an individual mission field. But there is a very public mission field, and it takes a lot of support. It takes a lot of energy. It takes determination. It takes commitment. And so thank you. Thank you on the part of the Pennsylvania Conference. Thank you on the part of the community for the energy, the investment, the time, the finances that you put into the school next door. Thank you so much. Today, and I'm going to go PowerPoint here, so if we could go with the PowerPoint. We'll just leave PowerPoint on, if we don't mind. Today, I'm going to speak about a subject that has become really dear to my heart. And what is a saying I say, Will, we have a long way to go? We have miles to go. Well, the other day, I've been concerned about religious liberty. I'm an old-time Adventist. I'm 72 years old, and I've been concerned about the work of the church, the world affairs as it deals with the church. And so months ago, I decided I've got to preach a sermon on religious liberty. I've got to preach a sermon on religious liberty. And I finally got around to putting a sermon together on religious liberty. And when I did it, I was apprehensive that we don't have miles to go anymore. We don't have miles to go. The coming of Jesus is at the door. And I became spiritually anxious for myself, anxious for God's people, because we don't have miles to go anymore. The coming of Jesus is at the door. And why do I say that? I'm a third-generation preacher. My dad was a preacher. My grandfather was a preacher from a fourth-generation Adventist family. My great-great-grandfather was a medical doctor right here in Pennsylvania. And for years, I've recognized the truths of the Adventist Church and the concerns that the Adventist Church have with this subject of religious liberty. And we've been concerned about this idea of the separation of church and state. And I suddenly realized as I prepared for this sermon that the walls of the separation of church and state are now gone. Legally, they're gone. In 2022, these walls were essentially taken down by the Supreme Court in the case of Kennedy versus Bremerton, as they chose to interpret religious liberty based on history and tradition rather than on legal precedent. And so the walls are gone, legally, respecting separation of church and state. And so as I reflected on that, I said to myself, okay, so the coming of Jesus is closer than ever. We know that the pieces are lining up as Adventists have talked about, and the coming of Jesus is really at the door. Where are we? How am I set up mentally and spiritually? How am I ready for the coming of Jesus? How are God's people ready for the coming of Jesus? Because it's really at the door. Are we spiritually in tune? Have we done our part to accept wholeheartedly with all our hearts the beautiful plan of salvation that Jesus offers? Or are we playing around? You know how it goes. And so as I reflect on this, I was driven to this sermon from that perspective. And so as we look at Jesus, Jesus preached this very powerful sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And as he preaches his sermon, you ask yourself, well, what's the most important part of this sermon? And of course, we have a hard time saying what's the most important part. But we do know that as a sermon comes to its conclusion, I do it myself, and Will does it, we all do it. As we come to the conclusion of the sermon, we give a big punch on what's really important. We really punch out. And we see Jesus doing this at the end of his Sermon on the Mount. He's punching out, and he's saying these words. He's saying, we read it in the scripture text, verse 13, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And there are many who go in by it. And as Seventh-day Adventists, we've chosen the narrow way. At least we think we've chosen the narrow way. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way by which leads to life. And there are few who find it. We'll go to the next slide. And as Jesus preached his sermon, he gives it the one punch, narrow is the way, but then he comes back and he comes back and he comes back and he ends up with this beautiful illustration. Matthew 7, verse 24. Matthew 7 says, therefore, if everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who's built his house on the rock. And so he's interpreting the narrow way. The narrow way says there is only one thing of value. There's only one value for us in life, and that value is Jesus. And so you have to build your house, that is, all of your house, on the rock. Matthew 7:24. And Acts 4 says exactly who the rock is. This is a stone which was rejected by you builders, which has become the chief cornerstone. Nor is there salvation in any other. For there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. This is it. It's the rock. It's the cornerstone, which the builders rejected. And it was stated as well in Matthew 21:42 and Psalms 118:22 is the original statement. And then Jesus comes to the conclusion of his sermon, and he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Now, I don't know if you've been to the beach recently, but I remember well some of the California beaches that I was at some years back, and you could literally see these houses falling off the sand because they weren't built on the rock. 1 Corinthians 3 says, for no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And so the emphasis is clear. As we face the end of time, as we face the coming of Jesus, as we come to the end of the affairs of this world, we have to ask ourselves a very simple question. Where do I spend my energy? What's the concentration of my thought and action during the day, minute by minute? What am I thinking about and living for? Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, and it's interesting, we go from those things that don't really burn to those things that really do burn, each one's work will become clear. For the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. And there's a message that's starting to come up here, and the message is clear. And 2 Peter 3 says it very clearly, the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in holy conduct and godliness? It's interesting that when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, God had an appointment with the Israelites. And the appointment was at Mount Sinai. And we know that this is a highlight of the Old Testament because God spoke directly to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. And he tells the Israelites, I want a covenant with you. I want an agreement with you. Let's get into a contract together. And as he talks to the Israelites, he gives them these 10 commandments. And the first commandment is the base upon which everything else builds. The first commandment says, and he speaks it from the mountain, and you can experience the power and the awesome grandeur of this unusual encounter between God and his people. He says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's it. Nothing else but me. No other gods. This is it. This is where value lies. In Jeremiah 31:33, he expands the thought here. This is the covenant. The commandments are a covenant relationship between us and God. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law in their minds. That's very interesting because when we look at the law of God, some people say it's been done away with. But God says, no, it's so important. It's going to be a very part of your personality. It's going to be your character. It's going to be ingrained in who you are. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. This is an exclusive agreement. I will be your partner in life. Now, when you have a really powerful partner, you've got an edge, right? And some of us boys who have had friends that were strong and powerful, when we were little kids, know what that's all about. You can go farther and faster and so forth. I have a friend that's an Alaskan. He's an Alaskan native, one of the original Alaskans. And the other day we were talking, and he was almost bragging about his ability to mine gold. He says, Ron, I know exactly where the gold is found. And I know how to go get it. But he says, a lot of the guys who go out and mine gold, they don't know what they're doing. And they'll take this pan, they'll put it in the water, they'll pick up some sand, and they can't find anything. But there's a technique to it, Ron. There's a way in which you do this. And he started to explain to me how you can do it in such a way that you don't lose the gold as you're sifting the sand out. And he was telling me, and this gentleman actually doesn't really care about money. I mean, he really doesn't. He's a unique individual, doesn't really care about money. I rarely see somebody like that. Doesn't really care about owning things. Doesn't really care about, getting ahead in life. He's just living. He's living the life in a free will style, and pretty interesting. And so, when I think about God's law, I think about this is a pretty good illustration. You know, we're sifting through the values in our life. You know, as we start living life, we start gradually through education, through experiences, through learning, relationships, talking to others. We develop values, and as we get older, our values synthesize and get clearer. We have reflections on our successes and failures. And when you come right down to it, God gave us the edge. He started out right to begin with and says, yeah, I want to let you know the value in life. And the reality is, he says, other than the rock, which is Jesus Christ, which is God himself, there is no value. I'm fascinated by God's messengers who have unique messages that are given by God for his people. We see the prophets in the Old Testament, and we've had the privilege of a prophet in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And you know what our first vision was? That's interesting. When God wanted to talk to the children, to his children, the Seventh-day Adventists, back in her day and in our day, he gave a vision to Ellen White. Her first vision was a vision of the people of God traveling on a narrow path. They were going up on a narrow path. And in this vision, she was looking for the people of God, and she couldn't find them. And God told her to look a little higher. And as she looked a little higher, she saw God's people traveling on the path. And as they traveled on the path, some of them got discouraged. And God would shine his light and brighten their path and encourage them with his arm. But others would fall by the way. And this is interesting. The first vision, right after 1844, she says, if they kept their eyes fixed on Jesus, who was just before them, leading them to the holy city, they were safe. But soon some grew weary and said the city was a great way off, and they expected to have entered it before. And I think it's a good vision for us today. Where some of us have gotten a little tired. We've believed that Jesus is coming soon, but we're tired. We need the encouragement. We need the bright presence of God to encourage us to stay faithful and not fall away. It's an interesting vision, that first one, because that first vision is followed by another vision. Another vision, and we go to the next slide. 20 years later, almost 20 years later, in about 1863, Ellen White has another vision. And this vision is really an expansion of the first vision. And I say to myself, okay, what is God emphasizing this journey for like this? Wasn't the first vision enough? Can't we just leave it at that? No, God says, I need to make sure you understand. I need to make sure you understand this trip that Christians take. And so he has an expanded vision that he gives to Ellen White. And it's so important that I'm going to read a summary of the vision in the biographical sketch of Ellen White, the second volume. It seemed that they, along with part of a large body of people, started out with heavily loaded wagons prepared for a journey. The road they seemed to ascend, on one side there was a deep precipice, and on the other a high smooth wall. As they journeyed, the road narrowed, causing them to leave their wagons and then their horses. As the perilous path narrowed, they took off their shoes. However, along the way they found ropes representing faith let down. These increased in size as they progressed. Finally, they reached a chasm, beyond which was a beautiful field of green grass. To get there, they had to rely wholly, that means completely, upon the ropes. By these they could swing to the other side. In whispers the travelers inquired, "To what is the cord attached?" Hesitating in distress, they heard the words, "God holds the cords. We need not fear." James first swung across the abyss, and Ellen followed. And they were safely on the other side, praising God and perfectly happy. Now, do you notice this expanded vision? God's people start out how? They start out with horses. No, not just horses. They have wagons. No, not just wagons. These wagons are loaded with all their possessions. You know, have you ever moved? Yeah, moving is a real painful thing. I hate moving. I've done it about 22 times. But I hate it. I hate it. It's just horrible. But you know, you pile everything up. You got to take this, and you got to take that, you got to take the other. And the little picture and the little memento that somebody gave you, you got to have it. And that's what they did. God's people were loaded, their wagons were loaded, and they started along. And you notice how they had to let things go. This is the narrow way. Because everything that wasn't God-centered, everything that wasn't built on God had to go. So they lose everything in their wagons, then they lose their wagons, then they lose their horses, and then they lose their shoes. Now, I'm impressed with that. You know, the road's so rough that you got to, and so narrow that is, you've got to let your shoes go, and then all you've got left is the rope. They had to completely rely on the rope. Nothing left. So I have to ask a question today, and it's a simple question. Where are our values? That's the question. You know what? My time is about done, but the seminar is coming up, and the seminar has to do with this too. So we're going to keep going for a little bit. Because the next part is really important, because Ellen White had the privilege. Have you ever been into a committee? Anybody ever attend a committee meeting? You're going to have somewhat of a committee, a business session. It's going to be a sort of a committee meeting. You get together, and I notice a pastor, and you need to be there at the meeting because it's a very important meeting for the church. A business meeting, you're going to try to organize how you can succeed with the mission of the church. So you need to be at this meeting. You really need to be here. So Satan has his meetings too, you know. He's engaged. We'll go to the next slide. Satan's engaged in meetings with his imps, right? And Ellen White had the privilege of attending one of Satan's meetings. Can you imagine? You're going to sneak in. Have you ever wanted to attend a really, really important meeting? You know, one of those meetings that talks about, you know, critical issues and is going to affect your life. Well, this is what we're going to do now. We're going to attend Satan's committee meeting. And in Satan's meeting with his imps, he's got a burden on his heart. Satan's burden is to how to take God's people off the path, right? Off this narrow way. That's his program. So notice what happens here. Satan is talking. And I'm going to give the introduction here that's not up on the screen. As a people of God, this is Ellen White writing, as a people of God approach the perils of the last days, Satan holds earnest consultation with his angels as to the most successful plan of overthrowing their faith. He sees that the popular churches are already lulled to sleep by his deceptive power. Now we're going to read these words. Satan talking. Our principal concern is to silence this sect of Sabbath keepers We must excite popular indignation against them. We will enlist great men and worldly wise men upon our side and induce those in authority to carry out our purposes. And here, guys, there's a separation of church and state wall that's disappearing. This is what you see happening here. It's coming down. It's down here in the United States legally. Then the Sabbath, which I have set up, shall be enforced by laws the most severe and exacting. That's what happens when there's religious liberty gone, right? Okay, so we're clicking here. Those who disregard them shall be driven out from the cities and villages and made to suffer hunger and privation. Okay, so now you're getting the picture that the narrow path is causing you to lose a few things. If you're on that narrow path, if you're centered in God, you're going to be left ultimately with only God. And Satan's going to make sure of that. Because if you leave God out, then you're out of the game too. As far as Satan is concerned, he's succeeded. Those who disregard them shall be driven out from the cities and villages and made to suffer hunger and privation. That means you're going to lose your house, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your home, you're going to lose your friends, you're going to lose your neighborhood, you're going to travel. But you're going to travel light. You're going to travel light. Go, and this, here Satan's talking. Go, talking to his imps. Go, make the possessors of lands and money drunk with the cares of this life. Now, what is this all about? Go, make the people who have resources, who have jobs that are important, and they have status, and they have nice places, go and make them think that this is so important. They're drunk with the cares of this life. Present the world before them in the most attractive light, that they may lay up their treasure here and fix their affections upon earthly things. Make them care more for money than for the upbuilding of Christ's kingdom and the spread of the truths we hate, and we need not fear their influence. So, don't come to the business meeting. Don't come to the business meeting because you got to take care of your stuff. No, what Satan is saying here is that he doesn't want you to go to the business meeting because your stuff's more important. But what God is saying is ultimately, hey, there's only one more important, and that's God. There's only one. And the last little part is really interesting. For we know that every selfish, covetous person will fall under our power and will finally be separated from God's people. You see, if you don't choose right, you're dead in the water. And that's what Jesus was saying. You've got to recognize, Jesus was saying in his Sermon on the Mount, there is a narrow way, but I have to tell you that's a pretty good way, but it's narrow. It's narrow. It's really narrow. You can have no other gods before me, God says. There is no other. I'll be your partner. I'll be your life partner, but it's all or nothing. It's all or nothing. If you are business oriented, anybody watch the Shark Tank at all? Anybody? There are some of you that watch the Shark Tank. Well, not very many. You guys are really impressive. Well, the Shark Tank is a TV program where really, really wealthy people interview really poor people who are just starting out in business. And these really, really wealthy people, they're billionaires like Mark Cuban there on the corner. They're really, really rich. Billionaires. They have resources to the nth degree. But you know why it's good for a beginning entrepreneur who's just starting his business, why it's good for him to have a partner from the Shark Tank? Do you have any idea? Well, why? Yeah. It's ultimately these Shark Tank billionaires will just grab these businesses and they can catapult them into success. They have marketing that's out the kazoo. They have everything it takes to take a little business and just pop it into success. And sometimes they'll do it for 5% of the business, 10% of the business, 20% of the business, depending on how they deal back and forth. But if you're a little entrepreneur and you want to get started and really be wealthy, well, you want a partner that really knows what it's all about. They can just pop you into success. The children of Israel had that experience with God. When they came out of Egypt, God popped them into success. They were slaves, remember? They didn't have anything. They didn't even own their lives. They were just nothing, right? But when they left Egypt with resources. And notice, I won't read the whole thing, but they were given favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Oh, yeah, right. And God granted them what they requested, and they plundered the Egyptians. Now, that's an interesting term. They plundered the Egyptians. When they walked out, they had more resources than you could imagine. And you know what God asked of them? Because they were in partnership with God. It was a covenant relationship. They had experienced the Passover. On the Passover experience, it was God or nothing. That's what the Passover was all about, Passover. When they killed the lamb, they said, we're going to depend wholly, completely on God. And so, when they come out, they come to Mount Sinai, God says, guys, and God's the billionaire, well, billionaire is really a bad term for God because it's all his, right? He made it all. So billionaire really shouldn't be even mentioned because God is super, super capable. It's beyond our comprehension. He does it all. He makes us. We're here because of him. So God says to the Israelites, I'm going to build a church. He tells the Israelites, I'm going to build a church. And as he says, I'm going to build a church, we'll go to the next slide. Speak to the children of Israel, God tells Moses, that they bring me an offering from everyone who gives it willingly with his heart. Take my offering. Remarkable. Israelites, the relationship that we have is a heart relationship. And we're going to miss our time. But it's a heart relationship. This is not a Shark Tank contract where, $1 is yours, $1 is mine. God says, you give it to me and watch what happens. But you have to do it willingly. You have to do it from the heart. You have to say, I'm all yours. You can't just do it out of obligation, say, well, God wants it, so I'm going to give it. That's what the offerings are all about. Offerings are a heart matter. You're going to get it out of your heart. God doesn't require anything else than a willing offering. That's it. And then God says, in Exodus 31, there was so much gold, silver, everything, so much material that they had too much. And so the priests had to say, hey guys, stop. We don't want any more. There's too much. There's too much. That's how the children of Israel responded. It was phenomenal. But God said to the Israelites, I'm in the salvation business, and the salvation business involves a church where we do salvation work. And in our salvation work, we have priests, to the next slide. And the priests that are going to continue day in and day out to do the work of the church, these priests, they're going to live by what you give. God could have said, you know what, I have all the resources in the world. I'm going to reserve the gold in this mountain for the priests, No. It's your involvement. God involves you. Why is God involving you in giving tithe? He's involving you in giving tithe because he's teaching you how to sift through the values in life. It's like the pen that's sifting for gold. The tithe is a constant recognition that the only thing of value is what God gives. The only thing. And so if you give the tithe on a regular basis to support the work, and who is the tithe for? It's to support the priests. In this case, today in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it's to pay for the people who minister the Word of God to us. And interestingly, next door with the teachers, 35% of teachers' salaries is supported from the tithe, I believe. Is that correct? 35% of the teachers' salaries is supported by tithe. So the Pennsylvania Conference supports your mission in more ways than most churches receive support, because teachers have to be paid just like ministers, and they're supported from the tithe. And so as we look at the purpose of the tithe, we recognize that the tithe is really holy. It's separated. And as a former treasurer, I'm going to sort of mix this up a little bit. As a former treasurer, we were very careful that tithe monies were spent for tithe purposes, to pay for ministers and for partial teachers' salaries, and they weren't mixed. Tithe money is not mixed with any other types of monies. And the church structurally does extremely good work in making sure that tithe money, is called temporarily restricted monies, is just uniquely spent for this purpose, according to the biblical model. And so we have auditors, we have certified public accountants that make sure that the monies are properly spent. And probably I'm going to say that I used to be an auditor for 10 years. I was an auditor for the General Conference. I'm a certified public accountant. And we made sure that the tithe money was spent for only tithe projects. It's very important. And so the tithe is a very valuable resource for the work of the church. Why? Does God need it? We need it to make sure that as we go through life, we're making a determination of what's valuable. And what's valuable is being in partnership with God. If we're not in partnership with God, then we have trouble. So a tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It's holy to the Lord. Now, some people say, I can't support the work of the church with my tithe. I used to live in Peru. And in Peru, if you go to I remember as a kid, I went to Nivati, a mission station in Nivati. I was shocked as a young person in Nivati mission station, because when the offering plate was passed around, there would be a couple of eggs, and there would be some onions and some flour and other things. And so by the time you got basket taken up in the Nivati mission stations, you would be loaded with produce. They didn't have money, they had produce, and they would load it up. I knew, in fact, we spent the night with the mission family that was responsible for the Nivati mission station in Peru, in the jungles of Peru. And the mission family was loaded with all this produce that they couldn't possibly all eat. And they didn't eat it all. Some of it went to the compost. But I'm going to ask you the question. Did the natives need to pay their tithe even if it went to the compost? Even if the missionaries couldn't eat it all? Did the natives need to pay their tithe? Yes. The natives were blessed. Even if it went to the compost. Sometimes we think, in fact, the other day I heard a very, very sad presentation where a gentleman said, we should not give tithe anymore because the church isn't spending it right. Well, who are we to give an audit to God's church for how we think the tithe should be spent? Isn't God capable of taking care of his tithe? If he wants the tithe to go into compost, what business is ours as to how God uses his tithe? And so I recognize that some of us make judgment calls on how we think the church is doing, and based on those judgment calls, make a determination on how we're going to support the work of the church. I believe that's dangerous ground. And we're going to keep going here. I'm going to finish up at 12 o'clock. I'm going to finish at 12, Will. It's going slower than I thought, but I've mixed it up. There's a very interesting situation with the Israelites with the Feast of First Fruits. And it's fascinating to me is that as God related to the Israelites, he would always say, you have to put me first. And you remember stories in the Old Testament, the widow that had to put God first by feeding the prophet. You remember the stories of the Old Testament. And God said this very, very much off from the beginning. And the Feast of First Fruits is interesting. As the Israelites brought in their harvest, God said, you shall eat neither bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh grain until the same day that you have brought an offering, the first fruits, to God. You have to bring the first fruits to God first before you do anything else. You can't eat of the harvest until you bring yours to God, your first fruits. And the fascinating part is, in Romans 11:16 we read, for if the first fruits is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And this is part of that deal. God says, I'm going to bless you if you give me a little bit. I'm going to bless you with all of it. It's a part for the whole. You give your tithe, and I'm going to bless you with everything in your life. I'm going to bless you with health. I'm going to bless you with your relationships. I'm going to bless you on and on. It's a part for the whole. Fascinating that the first fruits, referring to Jesus, in 1 Corinthians 15:20, Jesus is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And one day, we will be part of that great harvest because Jesus is the first fruits. And so this is what this is all about. It's all about Jesus. It's about centering our lives and our relationships in him. We need to recognize that the children of Israel weren't always as wonderfully faithful as they started out to be. And right there at Sinai, they turned away from God. I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it. Right there at the mountain, they turned away from God. Please notice that Aaron received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. Now, I have a question for you. That's an investment, all right. The Israelites, they really did. They invested in this golden calf. That must have been quite an investment. It took a little bit of gold. You can wonder how much there was in value in that calf when it came out. I have a question for you. How was their investment? Outcome. You know, an investment, you always think of an investment as having an outcome, right? It has an outcome. Then we read the rest of the story. He took the calf which they had made, burned it in the fire, and ground it to powder. We're talking about Moses doing this in Exodus 32:20. And he scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. So by the time they finished their investment without God, what was left of their investment? Where did it go? They expelled it through their body orifices. They expelled it. That's what happened to their investments. Ultimately, that's what happens if we invest without God. Deuteronomy 11:26 through 28 says, "Behold, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn away aside from the way which I commanded you today." Yes, there's a blessing and a curse. Haggai, the great preacher, prophet, that tried to build a temple, he struggled because the children of Israel, they said, "Hey, it's not quite time. It's not quite time to invest in God. Let's take care of ourselves first." Let's just read this part. It's so sad, but it's the way it was. Then the word of the Lord in Haggai 1, the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, "Is it time for you for yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, and this temple to lie in ruins? Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have eaten, you have sown much, and bring in little. You eat, but do not have enough. You drink, but you're not filled with drink. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put it into a bag with holes." It's sort of the same outcome. That's what the Israelites experienced when they had the golden calf, right? It's the same outcome. You're making money, but you can't keep it. It disappears because God's not first in your life. God's not first. Fortunately, I want you to know that with the message of Haggai, the Israelites repented. They repented, and they built the temple. So that's really good, isn't it? They repented, they built the temple. Prophets and Kings says this: "We are standing on the threshold of the crisis of the ages. In quick succession, the judgments of God will follow one after another. Fire and flood and earthquake, with war and bloodshed. We are not to be surprised at this time by events both great and decisive, for the angel of mercy cannot remain much longer to shelter the impenitent." If it was true in her day, I want you to know it's really, really, really true today. We need the message from God to transform our hearts so that one day there will be joy that we cannot possibly express right now. Because God will say, as Matthew 25:21 so well states, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. May the Lord bless us.